Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I'm going to be doing my mid-season review of Season 11 of Formula E. So first we're going to go through team by team in reverse teams championship order. So starting with the team in 11th and moving our way up to the team currently leading the championship, talk about the team, talk about their drivers and their season so far. And then at the end, we're going to take a look at the championship standings just overall and talk a little bit about the championship fight. So starting off with the team that's currently in 11th in the team's championship, and that is Cupra Kiro. So like I said, dead last in 11th with 18 points, which is 5 less than they scored at this time last year. Their best result so far this season is a 7th place, which they accomplished twice courtesy of Dan Ticktum. Now, in terms of average and medium starting position, finishing position, these are two statistics I like to use to basically try to approximate as best as possible the relative qualifying performance and race performance of a team. So for average starting minimum starting position, 8.14, and that's actually 3.17 positions better than last year overall. For finishing position, 10.71 so far this season, which is 1.1 positions better than this year. Now, of course, for Cupra Kiro, they are using the 1-year-old Porsche powertrain, and I think expectations were very low going into the season. That being said, I am somewhat pleasantly surprised that they have scored, a decent haul of points, pretty comparable with how many they scored last year. And again, when you look at the underlying numbers, it does suggest that they're actually a little bit better than they were last year, which does kind of tell you how bad last year's, Neo ERT powertrain was. Now, in terms of their drivers, first we're going to take a look at qualifying statistics, and then we're going to move into race statistics. So their two drivers, of course, Dan Ticktum and David Beckman. Now, for qualifying head-to-head, not particularly close here. I must say as well, for the qualifying statistics, these are basically corrected for qualifying groups. Of course, in Formula E, you have Group A, Group B, and so these stats are basically corrected based on, the speed difference, with track evolution between those two groups. So for quali head-to-head 6-1, again, like I said, in Ticktum's favor with a median qualifying gap of just shy of 0.3 of a second. Now, in terms of average starting position and finishing position for their drivers, for Ticktum, average starting position of 9.7 and average finishing position of 11.4, which suggests that he's maybe out qualifying slightly better than higher than he should, or just kind of suggests that the efficiency of the car is just not really there. Now for Beckman, average starting position of 14th, and again, like Ticktum, he generally falls back in the races with an average finishing position of 16.3. Now, in terms of rank and for the team's championship, or for the drivers' championship, Ticktum is currently 17th, whereas Beckman is 22nd. Ticktum sitting on 18 points, again, pretty decent haul, and that's all of the team's points that they've scored so far this season. Now, in terms of my expected points model, in terms of points above or below expected, Ticktum has scored 6.7 points more than expected, and for Beckman, of course, he scored 0, so it has to be a negative, and it's a negative 4.5. For the points above expected points, it does not include points for fastest lap or for pole position, just for your positions in the E-Prix. Now, moving on to the team in 10th, a bit of a pleasant surprise that they're not dead last. Again, coming into this season with a brand new powertrain, it was always going to be expected that they were going to be pretty slow this season, but they are sitting in 10th, tied with Cupra, with 18 points, which is actually one less than last year. Their best result is a second place, a shock second place that they achieved 2 events ago in Miami. Again, a little bit of a fluke result given how many drivers got penalties for the whole attack mode snafu that occurred there, but nonetheless, the team will definitely take it. Their average minimum starting position this year is 10.43, and compared to last year, that is 0.37 positions worse. So again, using last year's Mahindra powertrain, again, not a big surprise. Average minimum finishing position 12.57, 3.8 positions worse than last year, which again is going to hurt a bit, but using a new powertrain, not a big surprise. And this is really all this season is really building towards next year and eventually Gen 4 beyond that. Now, as for their drivers, Di Grassi and Maloney, I think Di Grassi's been decent. Maloney, I think, has been, a little bit hit and miss, especially in qualifying. But I do think, they are both being held back quite a bit by the car that they are driving. Now, for qualifying stats, Degrassi leads 4-3 there in the direct head-to-head with a median gap of 3.8 tenths of a second. Given that it's only, one extra victory for Degrassi in qualifying head-to-head, the fact that the median qualifying gap there really shows that when Degrassi out-qualifies Maloney, it's by a pretty big margin. And again, looking at the individual data points themselves, that, holds true. Now, in terms of average starting position and finishing position, 13.3 for Degrassi, 17.0 for Maloney. So you can see how much that, 3.8 tenths of a difference is making. Average finishing position, 12.8 for Degrassi. So he's moving slightly forward. Same with Maloney. His is 16.4. Now, when you look at points, that kind of thing, Degrassi ranks 16th with 18 points, of course, all of them coming from that podium. For Maloney, 21st, still no points on the board. And in terms of points above expected, not a big surprise. Degrassi is at positive 12.5, so he scored 12.5 more points than he would be expected to. And again, that second place podium definitely skews the numbers quite a bit. Assuming they don't get any more points for the rest of the season, for Degrassi, that number is going to keep going up, and for Maloney, that negative is going to keep getting closer to zero as, more data will kind of recalibrate, what the expectation is. Nonetheless, I think both drivers have been okay, haven't crashed too much, although, Degrassi did crash quite clumsily last time out in Monaco. So moving on to the team in 9th place, and that is Envision. Now for Envision, they of course are one of the two teams using the Jaguar powertrain, and Jaguar, spoiler alert, have had a pretty shocking season so far, as both the manufacturer team and both as a powertrain supplier. So currently Envision, their customer team sitting in 9th in the championship with 39 points. It is only 2 points less than they were at this time last year after 7 races, but they kind of got their act together in the second half of the season and were able to score more consistent points finishes. Whether they're able to do that again this year is yet to be seen, and given how they've gotten more than half their points from Buemi's big win last time out in Monaco, I don't think they can really expect to score such big points, on such a consistent basis, but we shall see. And again, like I said, that is, of course, their best result this season, that shock race 2 win at the Monaco E-Prix. Now, in terms of average minimum starting position, finishing position, 10.43 for starting position, which is 3.9 positions worse than last year, which means a qualifying pace, despite the fact that they have the exact same drivers, is a whole lot worse than last year. Average minimum finishing position, 8.29, which again is worse than last year, with an unchanged driver lineup, 1.41 positions worse than last year. So again, when you have two drivers that are, same driver lineup as last year, and you have such massive differences in those stats, really suggests either both drivers have fallen off massively or the car is quite a bit worse. I think I'm leaning a lot more towards the latter. So when you look at the individual drivers themselves, for Frijns and Buemi, 3 apiece in qualifying, I think they've both been relatively close, but I do think, both of them could improve quite a bit their 1 lap pace. Median qualifying gap, 500ths of a second, so almost nothing between the two of them. And despite that, there is a little bit of a gap in terms of average starting position. Average starting position for Frijns, 13.7. For Buemi, it's 15.4. When you look at average finishing position, despite the fact that, when we look at points later on, Buemi is the one who's ahead there. Frijns is actually the one with the better average finishing position, 10.8, whereas Buemi is at 12.6, which again, given how many, in terms of percentage, how many points Buemi scored with his win in Monaco, it does kind of make sense that Frijns could be ahead with the average finishing position. Now, for championship rank, Buemi sitting in 10th in the championship with 31 points, versus for Frijns, he's sitting 20th, 3 from the bottom, I should say, only ahead of the 2 rookies of Beckman and Maloney, sitting on 8 points. Now, in terms of points above expected, again, given a bit similar to Degrassi in Lola, given kind of the shock nature of that win that he got, not a big surprise that he's ahead in the points above expected category with a plus 16.8. Whereas for Frijns, again, that win maybe perhaps making the car look a little bit better than it actually is. His points above expected is a negative 11.4. Now, moving on to the team in 8th place in the team's championship, that is Maserati's currently sitting with 46 points, which is 19 less than at this time last year. Now, despite the fact that they've, I think, upgraded their number 2 driver spot in their lineup, replacing Daruvala with one of Gunther, one of Hughes or Van Dorn, depending on who you decide is number 2 driver. I think the fact that Gunther left the team, went to the Works Team DS Penske. I do think, for Hughes and for Van Dorn, at least in Gen 3, neither of them are really able to get to the highs consistently, or just anywhere near the highs that Gunther is able to get to. And I do think that's, holding Maserati's points total back a bit. So the best result so far this year is a 3rd place, courtesy of Jake Hughes, and that was at the 2nd race in Jeddah. Average minimum starting position 8.0, which is only half a position worse than last year, so it suggests qualifying pace is pretty much unchanged from previous years, or for last year in particular. And for average minimums, finishing position 7.14, which surprisingly, despite the fact that they have a lot less points, is 1.92 positions better than last year. If you look at Maserati's points total from last year, Gunther did a really good job the first half of the season. Looked like he could challenge for the championship and barely scored any points in the second half of the season. So if Maserati can kind of keep this pace up, scoring good consistent points, in the 7th, 6th, 7th, 8th range from here until the end of the season, they may actually end up ahead, quite a bit ahead of that points total from the end of last year. So, and again, underlying data suggests that, at least in terms of race pace efficiency, they are a little bit better. But I do think quite a bit of that is not necessarily them being a whole lot better, but that, some of their competition, namely Jaguar, has gotten a whole lot worse. Now, looking at their drivers, Van Dorn and Hughes, qualifying, Van Dorn's definitely been the better of the two. He leads the qualifying head-to-head 5-2 with a median gap of about 0.2 of a second. Average starting position, again, checks out 11.7 for Van Dorn and a 14.1 for Hughes. In terms of average finishing position, again, both of these drivers are moving up, improving on their starting positions. So for Van Dorn, it's a 9.4, and for Hughes, a 10.4. Now, when you look at points and points above expected, for Van Dorn, he sits 15th in the championship on 19 points, whereas Hughes sits in 11th with 27. So one of the closer teammate head-to-heads when it comes to points. And for points above expected, both of them are pretty close to average, but close to what you would expect. Van Dorn, negative 5.3, and for Hughes, a positive 5.0. Now, Jaguar, this is probably the team that's the single biggest disappointment of Formula E so far this season, sitting in 7th in the team's championship with a measly 50 points, 78 less than at this time last year. Their best result is Mitch Evans' win at the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, and we all thought that win was a sign of things to come. Mitch Evans finally being able to put up a championship challenge and perhaps win the Formula E championship for the first time in his career. Unfortunately, the races since then have kind of indicated that will not happen. Average minimum starting position this year, 9.16, which is a absolutely dreadful 6.26 positions worse than last year. Average minimum finishing position, same boat, a 9.0, 6.62 positions worse than last year. So this is a team that's completely fallen off. And a bit like what I was saying with Envision, either both drivers have gotten much worse or the car has gotten much worse. And given the quality and given how much Evans and Cassidy have shown over the years in Formula E, again, I'm tempted to believe that the car is just much, much worse than last year. And I think, they just have not been able to put together a consistent weekend whatsoever. Now, when you look at the results, Evans has been the better driver in qualifying. He leads the qualifying head-to-head 4-1. And despite the fact that we've had 7 races, there's actually been 2 races where, each of these drivers, Evans once, Cassidy once, have not been able to take part in qualifying because of technical issues. Median qualifying gap, 1.5 tenths of a second in Evans' favor, and that's a gap that I think is quite a bit bigger than Cassidy would like. Average starting position, 12.3 for Evans, 14.9 for Cassidy. Now, in terms of average finishing position, 14.8 for Evans. So despite how good he is in the races, that's actually, compared to his starting position, that's going backwards. So he's going backwards in the races. But for Cassidy, he is making improvement, 10.7. So I do think Evans has been the better driver in qualifying, but I think Cassidy's been the better driver in the races. Now, when you look at points, they basically sit level in the Drivers' Championship. They each have 25 points, but Evans is ahead on countback, courtesy of having all of his points come from that win in the first race of the season, which is kind of crazy to think about. In terms of points above expected, both of them are in the positives, scoring more than expected, but Cassidy does have the better stat here. So for Evans, positive 6.7, and for Cassidy, a 14.1. Now, moving on to Andretti, 6th in the team's championship on 68 points. Another team that I think are a little bit disappointed with how their season's gone. When you compare to how they were at this time last year after 7 races, it is 44 points less. But when you look at the second half of Andretti's season, how miserable it was, this is kind of more par for the course and, pretty similar to where they were, for the second half of last season. Their best result so far is a 3rd place, which was from the first race in Monaco, courtesy of Jake Dennis. Their average minimum starting position is 8.0, which is 0.62 positions worse than last year. So a little bit worse, but not a whole lot. Definitely not as bad as the drop-off that we saw from Jaguar, for example. Average minimum finishing position, 5.43, which is almost identical to last year, only 0.01 positions better. Now, for the 2 drivers, Jake Dennis, Nico Müller, this is where, historically qualifying has not been that big of a deal in Formula E, but I think this year in particular, the gaps between the teams are very small. We've had quite a few races, even the Peloton races, where if you qualify the back, it's pretty hard to move your way up to the front. And this is kind of, I think that the teammate pairing of Dennis and Müller is really showing how struggling qualifying can really sink your season. So qualifying head-to-head 6-1 in favor of Dennis with a median gap of 0.4 seconds. And despite the fact that I think Müller came in from Abt with, very, very high expectations, and I think, in the races, he's been okay. He's, scored, been pretty opportunistic at points, scoring points. But he's also had quite a few crashes. I think he's crashed out of 3 races out of 7, which is definitely far too many. And the qualifying pace is also a really big issue for Müller. Average starting position, you can see how much of a disadvantage it's putting Müller at, that 4/10 gap. For Dennis, his average starting position is 9.4, which again is not particularly great. Very, very hard to challenge for the championship when you're starting, 10th on average every race. And for Müller, 16.3, which is basically 7 positions worse. Average finishing position, both drivers are making up quite a few positions, which does suggest the car is quite efficient, and both drivers are generally performing relatively well in the races. So for Dennis, 5.8 for him, and for Müller, 7.3. So for Müller, even though he's really qualifying quite badly, again, DNFs are going to make it so that those bad results aren't going to show up in this stat. But 7.3 is still pretty good. He's basically moving up 9 positions on average from his starting position. Now, when you look at points, again, this is where the qualifying really hurts Müller. So for Dennis, 6th in the championship with 44 points, and for Müller, 14th with 20 points behind. Now, when you look at expected points, again, I think you would look overall and say, Müller's been a bit of a disappointment this year. But again, expected points is calculated based on where the drivers are starting. And you can see both of them are in the positive, which suggests they're both doing a decent job. For Dennis, positive 9.9, and for Müller, positive 6.2. So if Müller can, get his qualifying form turned around, if he can qualify in the top 10 regularly, he could be, a real threat, I think, for podiums and wins. But until he gets that qualifying form turned around, it's going to be very, very tough for him. Now, moving on to McLaren, the team that's 5th in the team's championship, 70 points so far this season, which is 7 more than at this time last year. Best result so far this season is a 2nd place, which was in the 2nd race in Jeddah, courtesy of Taylor Barnard, who I think has been probably the biggest, one of the single biggest surprises so far this season in Formula E. Average minimum starting position, 6.43, a little bit worse than last year, positive 0.12 compared to season 10. But the race pace, efficiency of the powertrain is, I think, a whole lot better. And looking at the data from their powertrain supplier, Nissan, again, that's generally what the data suggests. So average minimum finishing position, 6.14, so only a little bit better than the qualifying stat, but it is 1.92 positions better than last year. Now, looking at their 2 drivers, Sam Bird, Taylor Barnard, I think coming into the season, I think there was a lot of expectations that, Bird would lead this team forward. He'd be the number 1 driver, at least for this year. And then, for Barnard, it would be a learning year. and he would really, take it a step forward next year. But that hasn't really happened. It's been a much, much quicker kind of turnaround in terms of, who's been, the lead driver. Barnard's been excellent, particularly in qualifying, although he has been very inconsistent. So when you look at qualifying head-to-head, 5-2 in favor of Barnard, with a median gap of 3.2 tenths of a second. Average starting position 9.9 for Barnard. I believe he started in the top 3 or 4 times, but he's also started outside the top 10 of the rest of the races. So it's very, very hit and miss. It's almost like a Max Günther, kind of like a younger version of Max Günther. I believe Günther's second or third season Formula E, he was challenging for the championship by either winning races or not scoring any points. So it was one of those weird dualities, and Barnard's kind of like that in a similar way. Although I don't think it's necessarily crashing, which was a big issue with Günther early on. I think for Barnard, it's just, a bit of inconsistency. A lot of tracks he doesn't know, that kind of thing. Average finishing position, 13.0 for Bird, so he is, again, making progress on that starting position. But for Barnard, he's actually going backwards. It's 10.6, so it's about 0.7 positions worse than his starting position. And again, that's something that's kind of, normal rookie growing pains, and that's something that will, hope would assume would get better, with time and experience. Now, looking at points, Barnard's definitely gotten the vast majority of the team's points with 54. He's currently sitting 4th in the championship, and, we'll talk about championship at the end, but I do think, he does have, an outside shot at the title, but at this point, if your name's not Oliver Rowland, it's just going to be a long shot anyway at this point. But never say never. And again, especially don't tell that to Nick Cassidy after the big lead that he somehow managed to squander last year. For Bird, he's sitting 18th in the championship, definitely quite a bit lower than I think he would have been hoping. Sits on with 16 points. When you look at points above expected, again, kind of tracks with, the overall trend between the two drivers. Bird, -2, so a little bit worse than you'd expect. And for Barnard, plus 7.7. So again, doing a little bit better than you would expect for the young British driver. Now, moving on to DS Penske, 4th in the team's championship, 76 points so far, one better than last year. So again, very, very similar to season 10 in terms of, I think, in terms of points. Now, best result so far is a win in Jeddah at the first race, courtesy of Max Günther. He was absolutely on it, and that's exactly why you hire Max Günther. When he's on it, when he's in form, he's basically unstoppable. Unfortunately, the trick with Günther is that it's very, very hard for that, form to show up on a consistent basis. But he will definitely help you get wins, get podiums, several times a year. Now, in terms of average starting position, 3.86, 0.92 positions worse than last year, so a little bit worse. And same with average minimum finishing position, 5.57, which is 0.51 positions worse than last year. So again, despite the fact that he scored more points, the underlying stats suggest the car is a little bit slower, and that could be, the fact that they basically dropped Van Dorn, brought in Günther, and just having two drivers that are a little bit better, or at least in Gen 3, will help that points total a little bit and help the team in the team's championship. Now, looking at the qualifying data, Günther has been the better of the two, 4-3, but again, very, very close. Only one, battle between the two of them, with a median gap of 1.27 tenths in Günther's favor. So relatively close, but I think for Vergne, given his, reputation of being such a good qualifier, it is a little bit surprising that, that gap's not a little bit closer, that, Vergne isn't the one who's has the advantage there. Now, in terms of average starting position, 10.0 for Vergne, and for Günther, 7.4. So a little bit of an edge there. Average finishing position, 8.1 for Vergne, 8.8 for Günther. So you can see Vergne improving on his starting position in the races, in contrast with Günther, who's actually falling backwards. So I do think, Vergne is still probably the better of the two in races, but I think on at least consistently over the whole season. But again, Günther's form, when he's at that peak, is undeniably, very, very, very impressive. Now, when you look at, points and average points above expected, it, tracks with what I just said. So for Vergne, sitting in 9th in the championship, 34 points. Günther 7th in the championship with 42. Looking at points above expected, Vergne has the edge there, plus 5.4, whereas Günther's going a little bit less than you would expect, a negative 6.1. Now, moving into the top 3 in the championships, probably one of the biggest positive surprise in terms of team is definitely Mahindra. This was a team that was floundering towards the back for all of season 9, all of season 10, and right now they're sitting third in the championship with 91 points, which is 91 more points than they had at this time last year, which I know in the second half of the season they did, turn things around, were scoring some decent points, here and there, but those first 7 races, no points at all. So again, just kind of highlights how impressive the turnaround has been for Mahindra from the first 2 years of Gen 2. Their best result is courtesy of Nyck de Vries, a second place at the first race in Monaco. Their average minimum starting position, finishing positions, as you would expect, big jumps up. So 5.29 for starting position, 4.21 positions better than last year. For finishing position, 4.43, 6.13 positions better. So they're basically, according to those stats, that's like front-running team material. I know, again, the sample size might be a little bit small. And when we look at expected points model, the results for these two drivers, again, it does suggest that maybe these numbers are a little bit optimistic. Again, I do think, nonetheless, it's very, very impressive what they've managed to do, turning, the powertrain around both on 1 lap pace and in efficiency. Now, for Mortara and de Vries, very, very evenly matched in terms of qualifying. Qualifying head-to-head 3-3 apiece, but de Vries has been the better driver of late. Median qualifying gap, 0.03 of a second in Mortara's favor, but based on, the way that the momentum's going, I would expect de Vries to be the better driver from here on out. But again, in Formula E, momentum generally doesn't mean that much, unless, of course, you're in Berlin, of course. Now, in terms of average starting position, finishing position for Mortara, 11.7 with a finishing position of 8.9. De Vries has been qualifying in higher positions, or at least starting in higher positions. Average starting position of 8.6 with an average finishing position of 7.0. So these are both drivers who are generally moving up through the field as the races go along. Now, in terms of points, both of them are in the top 10 in the Drivers' Championship. De Vries in 5th, 52 points, with Mortara in 8th on 39. Points above expected, both of them are in the negative, but only by a little bit. So for Mortara, negative 0.6, which is very, very little. That's about very close to, even 100%. But for de Vries, negative 4.9, which again is not too bad, and compared to some of the other drivers, is honestly not too bad at all. Now, moving into the top 2 in the team's championship, and the team that I think is likely going to have your drivers' champion for season 11 of Formula E is Nissan. So for Nissan, second in the championship, 126 points, and despite, the big move up the grid, at least in terms of points, it's only 26 points more than last year. And I think a big part of that issue is the fact that, again, similar to Andretti, this is really a one-card team. Their best result is first. They've got 3 wins so far this season, all of them courtesy of Oliver Rowland. Average minimum starting position. This is the one that's the big difference from last year. Last year, we could see that the efficiency was really good, but the qualifying pace was kind of not quite there. But this year, average minimum starting position 2.14, which is 6.11 positions better than last year. Average minimum finishing position 3.29. That's 1.96 positions better than last year. So big improvements, absolutely massive improvement in qualifying pace, and a pretty good improvement in terms of race pace efficiency there too. Now, looking at their driver lineup, Rowland has basically absolutely crushed Nato, much in the same way that Dennis did last year, although actually probably by an even bigger margin. Qualifying head-to-head 6-1 in favor of Rowland, with a median gap of 4.88 seconds, which I believe is the biggest in this year's grid. Average starting position for Rowland, 4.3. He started in the top 4 every E-Prix bar 1. So again, extremely impressive by the British driver. Average finishing position, 4.4. Again, a little bit lower, but still very, very impressive. For Nato, average starting position of 11.4 and an average finishing position of 13.0. So despite the fact that this is really a front-running team, arguably the most efficient powertrain, he is losing positions on his starting position, which is, not really good. Hard to say what's going on, if he's just, not able to get the pace, mistakes as well. I do think he's been a little bit unlucky at times as well. For example, in Miami, with that penalty for the, for the attack mode. But nonetheless, you kind of have to make your own luck. And for example, for Rowland, even though he got very unlucky in the first race, pretty much every race since then, he's been, pretty much perfect and got really, really good results. Now, looking at points and such, For Roland, he leads your championship with 115 points. Nato is in 19th, 18 positions below him with 11 points, basically 10% of his teammates, less than 10% of his teammates' points, which is, quite bad. In terms of points above expected, it's about as bad as you would expect. Roland scored 26.6 points more than expected, and for Nato, based on his starting position, he scored 32.5 points less than expected. And basically, the whole reason why the team's championship right now is still pretty competitive is because Nato is basically, not performing that well, and it's basically a 2-on-1 between Roland and the two Porsche drivers of Wehrlein and DaCosta. If, the second driver at the Nissan seat was scoring 50 points, 45 points, the team's championship would not necessarily be done, but Nissan would be heavy favorites at this point in proceedings. Now, moving on to that final team, that is, of course, Porsche, leading the team's championship at the moment, 133 points, 24 points more than at this time last year. They only have one win this year, and that was a win courtesy of Pascal Wehrlein in Miami. Their average minimum starting position, finishing position. Qualifying pace, it seems a little bit better than last year, 2.57, which is 1.12 positions better than last year. On the flip side, race pace seems to be maybe a little bit worse, but I do think both drivers have gotten into quite a few incidents, and that could definitely drive the numbers down a little bit. I think DaCosta's had 3 different DNFs. He got, taken out in Monaco, in Jeddah, and Wehrlein, of course, got flipped around in Sao Paulo. So again, without those incidents, if they were able to finish, perhaps, things would look a little bit different. But again, it's only 0.37 positions worse than last year. So again, not a big difference. Still, one of the best cars in the field. And I think team's championship, favorites right now, just because they have 2 drivers performing pretty well. Drivers championship, I think, is going to be very hard. I think the really tough thing for Porsche is that they have 2 drivers for second and third in the championship, so it makes it really hard for them to prioritize one over the other, given that they're so close in pace. Now, when you look at qualifying, this was the aspect of racing of Formula E that DaCosta was really struggling with the first 2 years of Gen 3. And that's something that he's really kind of remedied this year. In previous years, Wehrlein would basically win, 70 to 80% of the qualifying duels. Median qualifying gap would be like 3/4 tenths of a second. Much closer this year, Wehrlein leads the head-to-head 4-3 with a median gap of 1.15. 0.115 seconds. Average starting position 5.9 for Wehrlein, 6.9 for DaCosta. So again, much closer there. With an average finishing position of Wehrlein 6.7, so he's actually going backwards, and DaCosta a 4.0. Now, when you look at points, again, like I said, second, third in the championship, DaCosta ahead of Wehrlein, only by a single point. But when you look at points above expected, it does suggest that DaCosta's been the much better driver in races. DaCosta, negative 0.8. So again, pretty much what you would expect. But for Wehrlein, based on where he's starting, he scored 16 points less than you would expect. So again, if he had scored those points, championship might look a little bit closer, and, it wouldn't be such a massive gulf between Roland and the rest of the drivers in the championship. Now, speaking a little bit more about that championship, I have the championship standings here. So as you can see, Roland 115 points, clear by quite a big margin. In terms of the margin, so let's see if we have to do some math. 30 plus 15, so 45, and then 3. So that's 48 points gap between Roland and DaCosta. That's basically, a win, almost 2 wins right there. And with 9 races to go, it basically means that DaCosta and Wehrlein are going to have to, basically gain about 6 points or so on Roland every single race. And whether that's achievable or not, it's hard to say. At one point, Cassidy had a very big lead, in the closing races of last year. Couple big non-point scores, big point scores for his rivals, and things, tightened up quite a bit. And that's kind of what's going to have to happen here. Roland's going to have a bunch of races where he doesn't score any points. I would say of the remaining races, he's going to have to not score on, I'd say 3 to 4 of them. And, DaCosta and Wehrlein are going to have to start winning races. When you look at, the race wins and podiums and stuff, it's a really, really big spread. 10 of the 11 teams have got a podium. In terms of race wins, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So again, 5 different teams, I think, have won races. So again, quite a big spread there. For any driver besides Roland who wants to challenge for this championship, they're really going to have to consolidate all the points around, that one driver. So for Porsche, it would have to be either DaCosta or Wehrlein getting, 3 to 4 wins for the rest of the season. They can't be splitting the wins, amongst them, because, realistically, they're not going to be able to, catch up to Roland unless it's all consolidated in one driver. So it'll be really, very interesting to see how things go. I think outside the Porsche drivers, I think Barnard has a chance. He has the same powertrain, but he is a rookie, and again, very, very inconsistent results. You can see he has 2 third places, a second, and then the rest of his point scores are finishes are outside the top 10. So very inconsistent, very hard to win the championship that way. De Vries, not sure if the powertrain's there, but I do think he's been pretty good this year. Same thing with Dennis and Gunther, again, same as Barnard. I think a little bit too inconsistent. I think for drivers who have the talent, again, like I said, Dennis, the 2 Jaguar drivers, unfortunately, I think they just don't have the powertrain this year, and their cars are just, not good enough, and they've dropped too many points. Like the Jaguar drivers, for example, they're already 90 points behind. Roland, they're almost certainly not making that up unless there's a massive, reversal of fortunes at Jaguar and for, Roland as well. So there you go. There is my mid-season review of season 11 of Formula E. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.